The Utah desert doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't care about rank, reputation, or the patches sewn onto your sleeve. It just sits there, flat and merciless, baking everything under a sky so white it hurts to look at. The hard pan stretches in every direction like cracked leather, and the air above it moves in ways that can't be trusted, shimmering, bending, lying to your eyes about distance and direction, and the space between where you are and where you're trying to reach. Dugway Proving Ground, July. 104 degrees by 9 in the morning. The kind of heat that makes metal too hot to touch and turns every breath into something you have to think about. The kind of heat that exposes things, that strips away the comfortable assumptions people carry into controlled environments and replaces them with the raw, indifferent physics of the actual world. 12 of the U.S. Army's best long-range marksmen had been assembled on the main evaluation line before sunrise. They came from different units, different states, different backgrounds, but they shared the same posture. The posture of men who had been told, more than once, that they were exceptional. Broad shoulders, easy confidence, the particular stillness of people accustomed to being watched and found impressive. They moved around the equipment with the casual ownership of men who had never seriously considered that the ground they stood on might belong to someone else's story. At the edge of the group, holding a bipod mount that nobody had asked her to hold, stood Specialist Casey Mercer. 26 years old, 5'6", brown hair pulled back low under a tan army cap. Her frame was slight in a way that people consistently mistook for fragile. She had stopped correcting that mistake a long time ago, because correcting it required energy she preferred to spend on other things, and because the mistake itself was useful information about the people making it. Her uniform was clean and correct. Her boots were worn in the right way, not for show, but from use. She stood with her weight balanced and her chin level, and she watched the Mk-31 prototype being uncrated from its transit case with the quiet attention of someone who has been studying a thing from a distance and is finally close enough to confirm what she already suspected. The Mk-31 was new. The Army had been developing it for 3 years in partnership with a civilian engineering firm out of Huntsville, Alabama. It was built around an advanced thermal auto-compensation system, a proprietary algorithm designed to calculate and correct for atmospheric distortion in real time, processing environmental data through a sensor array embedded in the scope housing and feeding continuous corrections to the elevation and windage dials. The idea was to remove the human variable from extreme long-range shooting. To make distance a problem the machine solved, not the man. Or the woman. The man running the evaluation was Sergeant Wade Collar. 38 years old, 15 years of service, 2 deployments, 1 commendation, and the kind of confidence that fills a room before the person does. He moved around the equipment with ownership, directing technicians and specialists with the economy of motion that comes from years of being the most capable person present, or from years of believing you are, which produces a similar outward effect until the moment it doesn't. He introduced the Mk-31 to the group without once saying Casey Mercer's name. She was listed on the day's manifest as Observer, a designation that technically allowed her presence on the line, but restricted her from participating in live fire. She had not been given a reason for the restriction. She had not been offered an explanation. She had simply been handed a set of observer protocols and told to stay back from the active positions, with the particular tone people use when they are enforcing a rule they expect not to be questioned. The bipod mount she was holding had been placed in her hands by one of Collar's specialists without comment, the way you hand something to furniture. Collar finished his equipment briefing and moved toward the line. He paused as he passed Casey, looked her over once, the brief, dismissive glance of a man categorizing a thing rather than seeing a person. He took the bipod from her hands. Then he put the empty carrying strap back in its place. "Hold that," he said. "Try not to trip over it." 2 of his men laughed. A third looked away. Dr. Set Calloway, the civilian systems engineer from Huntsville, who had spent 3 years building the Mk-31's compensation algorithm, stood at the data station 20 feet back and wrote something in his notebook without looking up. Casey Mercer said nothing. She took the strap and held it and watched Kohler walk away. And the only thing that changed in her face was something very small behind her eyes. A settling. The way a weight finds its lowest point and stops moving. She had been here before. Not this exact range, not this exact man, but this exact moment. She knew its shape. She turned back to the target line. At this distance, 1,000 meters to start, the steel plates were small rectangles of gray, barely visible through the shimmer. She looked at the wind flags posted at intervals along the range. She looked at the quality of the light coming off the hardpan. She licked her right index finger and raised it above her head for 3 seconds, feeling the differential cooling on the wet skin, noting the direction and the degree. Corporal Trent Okafor, Collar's nearest specialist, saw her do it and snorted. "Writing your diary out here, sweetheart?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to the line. Casey lowered her finger and reached into the left cargo pocket of her uniform. She removed a small notebook, the kind with a brown cardboard cover, worn at the corners from years of use. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote 2 numbers. Wind speed, temperature differential. She wrote a 3rd number, paused, then wrote a 4th. She had been watching the air above the hardpan since they arrived 2 hours before the evaluation began, watching the way the heat rose off the flat ground in spirals, subtle twists of refracted light, barely visible unless you knew how to look, unless someone had spent years teaching you to look. She had timed them against the second hand of her watch, 42 seconds. That was the interval between cycles. Every 42 seconds, the thermals rotated in a predictable, left-braking pattern before releasing, the distortion unwinding like a spring before resetting and beginning again. The Mk-31's auto-compensation algorithm processed atmospheric data continuously, but it processed it as random variation. It was not designed to recognize cyclical patterns. It was not designed to wait for anything. It corrected in real time against conditions that, if you watched long enough and carefully enough, were not random at all. Casey wrote a 5th number in her notebook. Okafor walked past her position a few minutes later, glanced at the open page, and took the notebook from her hand with 2 fingers, the way you pick up something you don't intend to take seriously. He looked at it like it was a menu from a restaurant he didn't want to eat at, then dropped it back in her direction. It hit the sand. She picked it up, brushed it off, kept writing. Calloway, at the data station, had been watching Casey without appearing to watch her. He had the particular attentiveness of a scientist, the ability to observe something peripherally while appearing to focus on something else entirely. He watched her lick her finger and read the wind. He watched her count seconds under her breath, her lips moving almost imperceptibly. He watched her write numbers that he could not read from this distance, but that she wrote with a certainty that he found professionally interesting. He turned back to his laptop and added a note to his observation log below the technical data from the equipment setup. Observer, female specialist, running independent atmospheric calculations, manual, no instrumentation, consistent with deep pattern recognition methodology, flag for review. He did not tell anyone else, not yet. She had thought about Frank Mercer that morning before the transport left the barracks. She thought about him most mornings, though she had learned to let the thought move through her quickly, like a cold front. Acknowledge it, feel it, let it pass. Holding on to it too long made her less sharp, and she couldn't afford to be less sharp. Not anywhere, but especially not here, where everything about her presence was designed to communicate that she didn't belong. Frank Mercer had been a Gulf War veteran, 3rd Infantry Division, a long-range marksman who had spent 2 decades of his life in service and another decade dying slowly from it, in the particular way that certain wars take the people who fought them long after the fighting is over. He was 51 years old when he died, which is not old enough by any fair measurement. The illness had come from Desert Storm, from the burn pits, the chemical exposure, the particular toxicity of a war fought in the wrong kind of air. It moved through him gradually, the way erosion works, taking a little more each year with a patience that felt deliberate. By the time Casey was 20, he walked with a cane. By the time she was 22, he was in a VA bed in Columbus, Ohio, and his hands shook when he reached for hers. But his mind never shook. Not once, not even at the end. She remembered the morning he had first put a rifle in her hands. She was 12 years old. Montana in November, gray sky, frozen ground, the smell of pine sap and cold metal and wood smoke from the house behind them. She remembered the weight of the rifle being more than she expected, and the way her arms had trembled with the effort of holding it level. Frank had crouched behind her, not touching the rifle, not guiding her hands, just close enough so she could feel that he was there, and that his presence was steadiness, not instruction. "You're fighting it," he said. "Don't fight it. The rifle isn't trying to go anywhere. Let it settle." She had let it settle. "Good. Now, before you think about the target, tell me what the wind is doing." She had looked at the trees at the edge of the field. The branches moved unevenly, more on the left side than the right, the movement quicker and then slower, in a rhythm she could almost count. "It's stronger on the left," she said. "By how much?" She studied the branches for another moment. "Maybe twice as much." "Close. What else?" She had watched for another moment. "It's not steady. It pushes and then it stops." Frank had been quiet for a moment behind her. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man saying something he had carried for a long time and was now, carefully, setting down in the right place. "The wind isn't your enemy, Case. It's just a variable you haven't learned to read yet. Everything has a rhythm, even chaos. Your job isn't to fight the conditions. Your job is to understand them well enough that you can move with them instead of against them." She had fired that morning. She had missed. He had told her why, precisely and without dramatics, and the following morning they had gone back out before the light was fully up. She did not miss the second morning. She did not miss many mornings after that. Kohler's first shot rang out across the range at precisely 9:47. 1,000 meters. The report was enormous in the open air, a flat, hard crack that rolled out across the hardpan and faded into the distance like a stone dropped in still water. Through the spotting scope at the observer station, the steel plate at the far end rocked back on its mount. Hit. Clean. The technicians noted it. Calloway typed something into his laptop without visible reaction. Kohler ejected the casing with a practiced motion and straightened from the firing position. He didn't look back at the group. He didn't need to. He knew the shot had been good, and he wore that knowledge the way certain people wear things they believe are permanent. Casey noted the shot in her notebook. She noted the time, the wind condition at the moment of fire, the position in the thermal cycle. She calculated, quickly and entirely in her head, how much the auto-compensation system had been required to correct for atmospheric distortion. The answer was very little. At 1,000 meters, the Mk31's algorithm was more than sufficient. The thermals at this distance were a minor factor, their effect on the round's path too small to matter against a target this close. She wrote a small minus sign next to the number, then an arrow pointing right, then a question mark. The question mark was for what came next. Kohler moved to 1,500 meters. The shot took longer this time. He was working with the auto-compensation system, letting it calculate, feeding it environmental data through the scope's sensor array, waiting for the system's confidence indicator to reach its threshold before committing to the trigger. The system was designed to do this work for him. That was the entire point of it. The plate at 1,500 meters rocked back. Hit. But Casey, watching through the observer scope, caught something the data screen didn't immediately register. The impact had been left of center by approximately 4 inches. Within tolerance for a pass, The Army's acceptable deviation at this range was 6 inches, but wrong in a way that would not stay contained. The kind of wrong that compounded itself over distance, that began as a 4-inch error and arrived at 2,000 meters as something much larger. She wrote a number in her notebook. Then she looked at the wind flags. Then at the particular quality of light bending above the hardpan at the 500-meter mark. Then she timed the thermal cycle again, counting under her breath, watching the shimmer. 42 seconds. The spiral broke left. The air flattened briefly to near stillness. Then the cycle reset and began again. The auto-compensation algorithm was processing atmospheric noise. It was measuring the distortion at the moment of measurement and applying a correction for that distortion. What it was not doing, what it had no capacity to do, was recognizing that the distortion was not random, that it followed a pattern, that there was a moment in every 42 seconds when the air above the hardpan went briefly, cleanly still, and that moment was the one worth waiting for. Casey wrote 2 more numbers. She drew a small diagram, 3 curved lines suggesting a spiral, with an arrow indicating the left brake and a dotted line showing where a round would travel if the correction was applied at the wrong point in the cycle, when the distortion had already begun to resolve. Okafor walked past her position and glanced at the notebook without stopping. He kept walking, but he slowed slightly, almost imperceptibly, before he moved on. His expression didn't change, but he slowed. It was during the gear rotation between the 2,000-meter and 2,200-meter setup that Kohler walked toward her position. He stopped in front of her, looked at the notebook in her hands, looked at her face. "What are you writing?" "Notes," she said. "Notes on what?" "Atmospheric conditions." He looked at the notebook for another moment, then at her, and something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite contempt. It was closer to recognition. The particular recognition of a man who sees something he has tried to keep out of the room, still managing to be present in the room, still doing what it does regardless of whether it's been invited. "You're an observer," he said. "You observe, you don't calculate." "I'm watching the range," she said. "That's observing." He held her gaze for 2 full seconds. Then, "What's that look, Mercer? Think Montana deer hunting qualifies you for a program like this?" She said nothing. He waited. She gave him nothing to work with. No anger, no hurt, no reaction he could use as purchase. She simply looked at him with the level attention she gave everything, the way her father had looked at difficult conditions, not as an enemy, as information. He turned and walked back to the firing line. Casey watched him go. She placed 2 fingers on the inside of her left wrist, felt her pulse, steady, 61 beats per minute. Her father had taught her that too, not with words, but by example. The way he could stand in a field, facing weather, facing a shot that had no right to be made, and simply be still inside himself while everything outside moved. Stillness, Frank Mercer had said once, is not the absence of feeling. It's what you build on top of it. Captain Dylan Reyes, who had said almost nothing all morning, stood 15 feet away and watched Casey take her pulse. He watched her release her wrist. He watched her open her notebook and continue writing. He said nothing, but he stopped watching the firing line and started watching her, with the quiet, systematic attention of a man revising an assessment he had formed too quickly. What Sergeant Wade Collar knew, and what no one else on that range knew that morning, was that Casey Mercer had outscored him. Not by a little, by 11 points out of 100. It had happened 18 months earlier during a qualification review that both of them had entered separately and independently in different testing windows, evaluated by different range officers at Fort Carson, Colorado. The results had been processed by an administrative unit, and for approximately 72 hours they had existed in the Army personnel system in their complete and accurate form, available to anyone with the appropriate access level. During those 72 hours, Kohler had seen the results. He had seen his score. He had seen hers. He had done the arithmetic twice, as though the second calculation might produce a different answer. It hadn't. He had then placed an administrative flag on her personnel file. It was a bureaucratic instrument designed to hold records pending formal review, a legitimate tool for a specific administrative purpose. Kohler had used the procedural authority that came with his rank to apply it to her qualification record, locking her performance scores from appearing on standard readouts. Anyone pulling her file through normal channels would see a blank where those numbers should have been, with a notation indicating a pending administrative review that had never been initiated and was never intended to be. He had not told anyone he had done this. He had simply done it and then continued doing his job, and the months had accumulated, and Casey Mercer had remained in positions that bore no relationship to what she was actually capable of. He told himself, in the way that certain people tell themselves things they cannot afford to fully examine, that he had acted in the interest of the program, that the program required demonstrated field experience, not just scores, that qualification numbers were not the same as capability under real conditions, that there were reasons, reasonable, defensible reasons, why a specialist with her profile was better suited to an observer role until she had more time. He was still telling himself this, standing at the firing line at Dugway, with the desert heat pressing down on all of it. He was still telling himself this when he looked out at the 2,000-meter marker and knew the shot had gone left, and knew that it had not been the wind. The notebook in Casey Mercer's hands bothered him in a way he could not entirely articulate. It was small. It was worn. It was the kind of notebook a person carries when they have been writing in notebooks for years, when the habit has become as natural as breathing, when the information going into it has been accumulating for so long that stopping would feel like a physical loss. He did not know what was in it. He suspected he would not like what he found if he did. Dr. Seth Calloway waited until Okafor walked to the far end of the equipment station before he moved. He picked up his own water bottle, half full, warm from sitting in the sun, and walked in a casual, indirect line toward the observer position. Casey looked up when he stopped beside her. She didn't say anything. He looked at her notebook, at the diagrams, at the numbers written in small, precise columns with a consistency that spoke of long practice. He was a systems engineer with 11 years of work on atmospheric compensation algorithms for precision targeting platforms. He understood immediately and completely what he was looking at. He was quiet for a moment that had the quality of recalibration. "You've been running the numbers this whole time," he said. His voice was low. Not a whisper, just quiet, the way people speak when they're saying something that belongs to two people and not to the room. Casey looked at him steadily. "I've been watching." Calloway looked out at the range, at the wind flags, at the shimmer of heat above the hardpan. "The thermal cycle," he said. "You timed it." 42 seconds, she said. "It breaks left before it releases. The algorithm is correcting against the distortion. It should be waiting for the resolution." Calloway looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has found a piece of data that doesn't fit his current model and has understood without pleasure or resistance that the model needs to change. He took a small drink from the water bottle. He put the cap back on carefully. He looked at the range one more time. Then he said, very quietly, "Don't share that with anyone before I give you a signal." He turned and walked back to the data station. Casey watched him go. She looked down at her notebook. She wrote one more number, circled it, drew a small arrow pointing to the thermal diagram at the edge of the page. 42 seconds. Left brake, release, reset. She looked at the wind flags. She began to count. The 2,000-meter shot missed. The range officer's voice came through the speaker with the professional flatness of someone whose job required them to report facts without editorial. "Miss, 5 meters left." Kohler stayed prone for a moment. Then he rose and looked at the scope readout. "Wind shifted," he said. Casey looked at the wind flag at the 2,000-meter marker. It had not shifted. She looked at the flag for a long time. Then she looked at her notebook. Then she wrote one word in small, precise letters beneath her calculations. Predictable. The thermal cycle had been at its release point, the moment when the left braking spiral was flattening before resetting, when caller fired. The auto compensation system had applied a left correction for a distortion that had already begun to resolve. It had pushed the round in the direction of a distortion that was no longer fully present. 5 meters left of where clean air would have sent it, the machine had been wrong about the timing. The machine could not recognize timing because the machine did not understand that the chaos was not random. It had never been designed to understand that. It had been designed to measure and correct endlessly in real time against a world it could only see in the present tense. Casey's father had taught her a different tense entirely. The 2,200-meter shot missed. The 2,500-meter shot missed by more. Kohler made adjustments after each failure. Scope corrections, position adjustments, algorithmic overrides that were technically correct within the Mk-31's design parameters. They were wrong because those parameters described a world that did not match the actual world of the Dugway hardpan at 2 in the afternoon in July, where the thermals ran on a cycle that no sensor array had been programmed to detect. The mood on the firing line had moved past tension and into something quieter and more corrosive. The technicians spoke in lower voices. Okafor had stopped making comments entirely. He stood near the equipment cases and watched the range with the careful, private attention of a man who has begun the uncomfortable process of revising something he believed. At 2,800 meters, Kohler fired 3 times. All 3 missed. He stood from the prone position and pulled off his shooting glove with a sharp, hard motion. He looked at the scope readout. He looked at the atmospheric display. He looked at the wind flags. He looked at Callaway with the particular expression of a man who has run out of variables to blame and has arrived at the uncomfortable border of the ones he cannot name. The platform's got a compensation error, he said. The algorithm's fighting the mirage instead of accounting for it. Callaway looked at his screen with the even expression of a man who has delivered unwelcome news before and has learned to do it without editorializing. The platform is performing within design specifications, he said. Kohler looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to Reyes. We're burning daylight on a platform that can't perform at distance. I'm recommending we close the evaluation and write it up as an environmental limitation. Reyes looked at the range. He looked at the data station. He looked, briefly, at the observer position where Casey Mercer stood with her notebook. 10-minute equipment break, he said. Then we reassess. Kohler pulled off his second glove. He dropped it on the sandbag rest. He passed Casey on his way to the equipment cases. Harper can hold the rifle while we take a break, he said, the wrong name, catching himself half a second too late, not correcting it, walking on. One of his specialists brought the Mk-31 to the observer position and set it on the bipod rest. Casey put her hand on the stock. The metal was warm from the sun, but not from firing. The rifle had spent the afternoon being systematically wrong, and it had not gotten hot from that. It had simply been wrong, over and over, at distances where being wrong mattered enormously. She felt the balance of it. The weight distribution forward of the grip, the way the action sat in the chassis, the particular geometry of a precision instrument built to tolerances that had been exceeded not by the machine, but by the assumptions behind it. He had watched her all morning, dismissively at first, then with the reluctant attention of someone who keeps encountering evidence that contradicts a position they've committed to. He had watched her read the wind and time the thermals and fill the notebook with numbers he didn't understand. But this, the repositioning of her hands on the stock, this he understood. This was not a pose. This was not performance for an audience. This was a person who had put their hands on a rifle so many times that the rifle had learned the shape of them. He stood near the equipment cases and thought about the number 42, which he had heard her count under her breath twice now, without understanding why, and thought about the fact that every miss had gone left, and thought about his own notebook, which contained nothing. He did not say anything. He looked at the ground. At 2850, Kohler positioned himself for what he announced would be the final distance of the evaluation. 2,850 meters, nearly 2 miles of Utah hardpan, heat shimmer, atmospheric distortion, and the invisible physics of a rotating Earth pulling every projectile in directions that had to be calculated or accepted as error. The Mk-31 was built for the calculation. The shot went wide, not close, not a near miss that a different adjustment might have corrected. It went wide in the particular way of a system that has been given the wrong framework to work from. Not a malfunction, but a philosophical error. The error of a machine that had been designed to solve a problem that turned out not to be the actual problem. "Miss," the range officer said. "Approximately 8 meters left." Kohler lay prone for a long moment. Then he stood. He picked up his gloves. He looked at Reyes with the expression of a man whose decision has already been made and who is now simply announcing it. "Pack it up. We write this as an atmospheric limitation on the platform. Request follow-up evaluation under different conditions." He turned toward the equipment cases. At the data station, Calloway closed his laptop with a quiet, deliberate click. He did not look at Casey directly. He set his pen down on top of the closed laptop, parallel to its edge, and left it there. It was the signal. And Casey Mercer said, "Captain Reyes." Her voice was quiet. It carried exactly as far as it needed to. Every head on the range turned toward it. She was standing at the observer position with her notebook in one hand and the Mk-31's carrying strap in the other. And she was looking at Captain Reyes with the flat calm of someone who has been waiting for a specific door to open and has just heard the latch click. "I'd like to request one shot," she said. The desert held its breath. Kohler's jaw tightened. Reyes looked at her without expression. Calloway at the data station did not move. Okafor looked at the ground, and somewhere to the east, 2,850 meters away, a steel plate sat untouched in the shimmer, in the heat, and the thermals above the hardpan completed their cycle, spiraling left, releasing, resetting, on schedule, as they had been doing all day, patient and consistent, waiting for someone who understood their rhythm. 42 seconds, same as it had always been. Most people, when they are being humiliated in front of a crowd, want to fight back. The instinct is old and honest. It rises from somewhere below thought, from the part of a person that exists before language and reason and training. When someone diminishes you in front of witnesses, the body wants to respond. The jaw tightens, the hands close, the voice rises. It is a biological argument for your own significance, automatic and ancient. Casey Mercer had learned something different. She had learned it in Montana, in the cold dark of pre-dawn mornings, when her father would wake her before the rest of the world was ready to be awake. And they would walk out into the fields together without speaking, their boots on frozen ground, their breath visible in the still air. She had learned it through the long discipline of waiting for a shot that wasn't ready yet, of holding still while everything in her wanted to move. She had learned it in the particular school of a man who understood that the most dangerous thing a shooter could do was act before the moment arrived. "Patience," Frank Mercer had told her once, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with cold coffee and the mountains going pink with morning, is not the absence of urgency. It's what you build when urgency has no useful place to go. She was building it now. Captain Dylan Reyes had not yet responded to her request. He stood at the edge of the firing line with his arms loose at his sides and his dark eyes moving between Casey's face and the notebook in her hand and the Mk-31 sitting on its rest. He was a man who had learned to read situations the way certain people read weather. Not just the current conditions, but the pressure systems behind them, the directions things were moving, the difference between a front that would pass and one that would not. He was reading this one carefully. Kohler had not moved. He stood with his back partially turned, gloves hanging from his right hand, in the particular stillness of a man who is very deliberately not looking at something because looking at it would require acknowledging it. Nobody spoke. The generators hummed. The wind flags at the 2,000-meter markers lifted and fell in a rhythm that Casey had been watching all morning. The thermals above the hardpan completed their cycle, spiraling left, releasing, resetting, patient and indifferent and perfectly consistent. Calloway's voice came from the data station without rising above conversational level. Additional data point, he said. He said it the way an engineer says things that are technically true and professionally defensible and happen, incidentally, to be useful to someone else's cause. Even a miss provides information about manual operation of the platform under these conditions. It's within scope for the evaluation objectives. Reyes looked at Calloway for a moment. Then he looked at Casey. She met his gaze and held it. She did not plead. She did not explain. She did not offer credentials or arguments or the qualification scores that should have been visible in her file and weren't. She stood the way her father had taught her to stand when the moment required presence rather than performance. And she let him see what was there to see if he was willing to look. He nodded once. "One round, Mercer," he said, "for the record." Color turned around. The color that moved into his face was not quite anger, though it resembled it from the outside. It was something older and more complicated. The particular color of a man watching a situation he has spent 18 months engineering move in a direction he can neither redirect nor stop, and understanding with great clarity exactly why that is. "Captain." His voice was controlled and military and working hard to stay that way. "She's designated observer. Live fire is outside her authorization for this evaluation. Protocol exists for a reason. If we begin making exceptions based on," he paused, choosing his word carefully, "sentiment, we undermine the purpose of a controlled test." Reyes looked at him with the patience of a man who has made his decision and does not intend to revisit it. "Captain Reyes authorized the shot. That is within my authority and the scope of this evaluation." A single beat. "Thank you, Sergeant." The two words closed the conversation the way a vault door closes, quietly, finally, with a weight that made further argument feel not just futile, but somehow beneath the room. Kohler stood very still for a moment. Then he stepped back from the firing line with the careful, deliberate motion of a man managing something in his chest that he has no intention of displaying. Casey moved to the firing position without ceremony. She set the Mk-31 on the bipod rest and lowered herself into the prone position, the way people lower themselves into things they have done so many times they no longer have to think about the mechanics. Her cheek found the stock. Her support hand settled under the forend with the particular ease of a fit that has been established through repetition. Her trigger hand came up and her finger rested outside the guard, where it belonged. Relaxed, ready, not yet committed to anything. She did not rush any of it, and then her right hand trembled. It was small, a fine tremor in the fingers, barely perceptible unless you were close and watching for it. But Okafor was close and had been watching her for the last hour with the attention of a man who has been wrong about something specific and is in the process of determining the precise dimensions of that wrongness. He saw it. Before he could stop himself, he leaned slightly toward Kohler and said, low and without thinking it through, "She's shaking." Kohler looked at her right hand. He saw the tremor. Something moved across his face. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both, something that wanted to be certainty. "That's nerves," he said quietly. "This is over before it starts." He said it to Okafor, but he said it in the way of a man who is trying to convince himself as much as anyone else, stacking the words like a small wall against something he doesn't want to arrive. What Kohler did not know, and what Okafor would not have recognized, was what that tremor actually was. Casey Mercer had been 23 years old when a training exercise at Fort Carson went wrong, in the specific, permanent way that certain training exercises go wrong. A misfire, a ricocheted fragment that caught her at the base of the thumb on her right hand. Nothing that cost her the hand, nothing that ended the career, but something that lodged in the nerve pathways in a way that 3 years of physical therapy and 2 more years of her own stubborn, methodical work had diminished but not erased. In moments of high stress, under significant pressure, with an audience, with something real at stake, her right hand trembled. It had done so for 3 years. It would likely do so for the rest of her life. She had learned to work with it the same way Frank had taught her to work with wind. Not fight it, understand it, find its rhythm. Find the space inside it where the shot could still be made correctly. She closed her eyes. The desert noise fell away in layers. The generators first, then the sound of shifting feet behind her, then Kohler's voice somewhere at the edge of things. All of it receded until there was nothing but the interior space her father had taught her to build. Clean, dimensionless, the particular silence that exists inside a person who has learned to be still. She breathed in for 4 counts. She held for 4 counts. She breathed out for 4 counts. She held for 4 counts. The tremor in her right hand slowed. It did not disappear entirely. It never did, and she had stopped expecting it to. But it settled into something she could account for. Something she could factor into the shot the way she factored everything else. Another variable. Another thing to read rather than fight. The tremor had a frequency, and she knew the frequency, and she had learned to find the moments of relative stillness within it, the way a musician finds the beats within a measure. She opened her eyes. The scope was before her. 2,850 meters of Utah hardpan stretched away in the shimmering afternoon light. She found the target, a gray rectangle in a gray shimmer, barely distinguishable from the heat haze surrounding it. She let her vision settle on it without strain. She began to count the thermal cycle. Behind her, nobody moved. The evaluation line had gone to a silence that was different from the silence of waiting. It was the silence of people who are watching something they don't yet understand and are beginning to feel the first pressure of the possibility that they should. Okafor stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the back of Casey Mercer's head, and the number 42 moved through his mind without context or explanation. A frequency he had picked up without knowing how to tune to it. Something he had heard her count twice now and not understood, and was only now beginning to suspect he should have. Calloway had not reopened his laptop. His hands rested on the closed lid, and he watched the firing position with the focused stillness of a scientist observing a procedure he has reason to believe is going to produce results that will require him to revise something significant. Kohler stood at the edge of the line and watched Casey's right hand and did not speak. The tremor had nearly stopped. He watched this happen, watched the hand settle, watched the frequency of the tremor reduce until it was almost nothing, and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and because watching it happen was doing something to him that he did not want to examine closely. He tried once more. Reyes. His voice came out differently than he intended, quieter. This is a waste of ordnance. Reyes did not look at him. Noted, he said, and then he went back to watching Casey Mercer breathe. She was not the first person Frank Mercer had started from the beginning. He had been patient about beginnings, genuinely patient, the kind that comes from understanding rather than temperament. It was the middle parts he had little tolerance for, the comfortable plateau where people had learned enough to feel capable and had stopped pushing against what they could not yet do. She thought about him now, not as a memory with edges, but as a presence, the way certain people remain present after they are gone. Not as ghosts, but as something woven into the way you move through the world, the way you see things, the way you wait. She thought about a morning at the Montana range when she was 19. She had heard, secondhand and obliquely, about the Iraq shot. A man who had served with Frank had mentioned it in passing, in the way people mention things they consider established history, as though she would already know. She had gone home and asked her father. Frank had been quiet for a long time. They were sitting on the tailgate of his truck, coffee going cold, the mountains to the west like a wall that had been there before everything else and would be there after. "You want the technical answer or the real one?" he said. "Both. Technical answer is that I accounted for every variable I could calculate, and then I stopped calculating and made the shot. What's the real answer?" He looked at the mountains for a moment. "The real answer is that I stopped trying to control the outcome and just tried to do the work correctly." He drank his coffee. The outcome takes care of itself when the work is right. She had not fully understood it at 19. She understood it completely now. She was doing the work. She had been doing it all morning, in the worn notebook, in the numbers written in careful columns, in the patient observation of a range that had been describing itself in precise and readable detail to anyone willing to sit with it long enough to understand what it was saying. She had counted the thermal cycles through the entire evaluation. She had timed the wind shifts against her watch. She had tracked the pressure differential that had developed in the last 90 minutes as the temperature peaked and the atmosphere above the hardpan thinned in ways that changed the density gradient by a margin that was small as an absolute number and enormous as a practical one at this distance. All of it was in the notebook. All of it was now in her head, organized and ready, the way her father had taught her to carry a calculation, not as a formula you consult, but as an understanding you inhabit. She reached for the auto compensation toggle on the MK-31's control panel. She switched it off. A sound moved through the group behind her. Not words, just a collective exhale, involuntary and immediate. The sound of people watching someone do something they did not anticipate and do not entirely understand. What is she doing? One of Kohler's technicians. Not a question. A statement of something that had moved past surprise into something more unsettled. Kohler looked at the control panel readout. He saw the auto compensation status indicator go dark. He stared at it for a moment, and something moved through his expression, through several stages of something, before it settled on what looked, from the outside, like contempt, but was built from the inside out of something he would not have named. "She just disabled the only system keeping this platform functional at this range," he said. "Someone tell me why we're still doing this." Nobody told him. Nobody moved. Casey made her manual adjustments. They were small and deliberate, and they took approximately 40 seconds. She corrected elevation for the Coriolis deflection at 40 degrees north latitude, where the rotation of the Earth introduced a rightward pull on any projectile traveling north that the auto compensation system calculated automatically against a static atmospheric model, but that Casey calculated differently against the actual thermal cycle, because the density layer the round would travel through was not static, and the Coriolis pull varied with density in ways the algorithm's baseline did not capture. She adjusted for humidity. The afternoon humidity at Dugway had dropped 3 percentage points in the last 90 minutes as the temperature peaked, changing the air density above the hardpan in a way that would push the round slightly high at this distance, if not addressed. She accounted for the wind not as it currently was, but as it would be in 2.5 seconds, when the round, traveling at just under 900 meters per second and decelerating through the atmosphere, would be crossing the 1,500-meter mark. She had been watching the wind flags all morning. She knew their pattern the way you know the pattern of something you have been watching for hours without looking away. She dialed in the final correction. She settled her cheek back against the stock. The tremor in her right hand was a background frequency now, something she was inside rather than fighting, something she breathed with rather than against. She found the valley in her own pulse, the small gap between heartbeats where the body is momentarily, briefly still, where a trigger pull can happen without introducing movement that hasn't been accounted for. She began to count. The hard pan shimmered. The heat spiraled upward in its rhythm, invisible to the eye but legible if you knew how to watch the light bend. If someone had spent years teaching you that light bending was language, and that the language was worth learning. Casey watched the light. 30 seconds. Kohler had stopped speaking. Whatever he had been building toward, whatever authority or objection he had been reaching for, it had encountered something in the stillness of the figure on the firing line and had simply failed to form. He stood at the edge with his gloves in his hand, and he watched. 35 seconds. Okafor looked at the wind flags. He looked at the heat shimmer above the hardpan. He did not know what he was looking for. He was looking for it anyway. Calloway leaned slightly forward, pen in hand, nothing written. 40 seconds. The thermal cycle approached its release point. The spiral above the hardpan began to flatten, the left-braking distortion unwinding as the heated air exhausted its rotation and prepared to reset. The air above the range was moving toward the brief, clean stillness that occurred at the 42-second mark, the moment between one cycle and the next when the atmosphere, for a fraction of a second, simply was. 41. Casey found the valley between her heartbeats. 42. The air above the range went briefly, cleanly still. She squeezed the trigger. The Mk-31 fired with the enormous, flat report of a precision rifle doing precisely what it was designed to do. The recoil came back through her shoulder in a familiar, honest push. The kind of physical fact that has no subjectivity to it, that simply is and cannot be argued with. She stayed on the scope. She watched the target through the shimmer. 2.5 seconds of silence. They stretched. The range officer's voice came through the speaker on the support table. A young voice, professional and uninflected, carrying clearly in the absolute stillness that had settled over the evaluation line. Center, first round, no correction required. The words arrived one at a time, each one slightly heavier than the one before it, each one landing in the silence and staying there. Nobody moved. Calloway looked at his monitor. He looked at it again. He pressed the earpiece in his left ear and confirmed with the downrange observer team. He listened to the confirmation. Then he took his hands off the closed laptop entirely and sat back in his chair with the expression of a scientist who has observed something that does not fit inside his existing framework. Not with resistance, but with the specific alertness of a man who understands that his framework needs to be rebuilt, rather than the observation dismissed. Okafor turned slowly and looked at Kohler. Kohler was standing at the edge of the firing line, with both hands at his sides, and the color leaving his face in stages. Not dramatically, not collapsing, but steadily and without recovery, the way certainty leaves when the evidence against it is too specific to be reframed. His mouth was open, not in shock exactly, in something quieter and more permanent, something that had no quick recovery built into it, no procedural next step, no argument that could restore the ground he had just lost. He was looking at the data screen, at the impact confirmation, at the number corresponding to the location on the target where the round had hit. Center mass. First round. No correction required. His mouth closed. He looked at Casey. She was rising from the prone position with the same quiet economy she had brought to the firing line. She cleared the chamber, set the safety, placed the Mk-31 carefully on its bipod rest, the way you set something down when you respect what it is. Then she looked at the notebook in her left hand for a moment, tucked it back into her cargo pocket, and straightened up. She did not look at Kohler. She had not looked at him since the shot. Not once. Not with satisfaction, not with contempt. Simply, there was nothing in his direction that she needed to see. Calloway reached her in 4 long strides with his clipboard, and his pen reactivated. The thermal cycle, he said. You waited for the release point. You fired into the flat air. The algorithm was correcting against the distortion, Casey said. Her voice was even, not flat, not triumphant. The voice of someone reporting an observation accurately, because accuracy was the point. It should have been waiting for the resolution. How long to establish the cycle? About 20 minutes after we arrived. The humidity correction was manual, dropped 3% in the last 90 minutes. Changes the density gradient above the hardpan at this distance. The Coriolis compensation. You adjusted differently than the system default. The system default uses a static atmospheric model. The thermal cycle changes the effective density layer the round travels through. The Coriolis pull varies with density. I adjusted for the actual layer, not the modeled one. Calloway stopped writing. He looked at her with the expression of a man reformatting a significant amount of previously organized information. That's not a documented correction method, he said. I know, she said. Where did it come from? She was quiet for a moment. My father, she said. He worked it out in Iraq in 1991. He never published it. He just used it. And then he taught it to me. Calloway looked at his clipboard, looked at the range, looked back at Casey. I need to document everything you did today, he said. Every adjustment, every calculation, every timing decision, all of it. All right, she said. Captain Reyes stepped forward. He stood in front of Casey and was quiet for a moment. And in the quality of that quiet, there was a weight that was not ceremony, but was not nothing either. He looked at her the way people look at things that confirm something they suspected too late. You've honored the uniform today, Mercer, he said. Quietly, once, without theater. It was enough. Behind him, the evaluation line had reorganized itself around new gravity. The technicians who had been hovering at the perimeter moved toward the data station with the focused urgency of people who have encountered something important and need to understand it. They pulled up atmospheric logs, comparison screens, the impact data from every shot of the day. They spoke in low, quick voices. Okafor stood apart from all of it. He stood near the equipment cases and looked at the ground, and then at Casey, and then at the ground again. He was doing something that did not have a clean name. Something related to conscience, something related to shame, something related to the specific discomfort of a man who has been part of something he cannot now uncomplicate. He had held that notebook. He had glanced at the numbers and dismissed them. He had laughed at a woman who had spent the whole day being exactly right about everything, while everyone around her was exactly wrong. He said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides and did the arithmetic of what he had done and what it had cost, and found the total uncomfortable. Kohler had not moved from the edge of the firing line. He stood where he had been standing when the shot landed, with his gloves in his jacket pocket now, and his face arranged in something that was working hard to be composed and not entirely succeeding. The data station activity moved around him. The sound of Calloway's questions and Casey's answers reached him in pieces. He knew what he had done 18 months ago. He knew why. He knew that what had happened at 2850 meters had created a paper trail that was going to intersect with every decision he had made since the day he had seen her qualification scores and done the arithmetic twice. He looked at the impact confirmation one more time. Center, first round, no correction required. He had spent 15 years being the most capable person on the range. He had spent 18 months ensuring that the one person who might complicate that remained an observer. He had called her the wrong name. He had handed her a carrying strap. He had watched her hold a rifle that the best men he knew couldn't make work, and she had waited for 42 seconds of the right air and put a round through steel at nearly 2 miles. She had not looked at him since. Not once. Not with triumph, not with anger, not with the vindication he might have expected from a person who had been treated the way he had treated her. She had simply done what she came to do, and then she had begun explaining it to the people who wanted to understand it, and he was nowhere in that picture. He put his hands in his pockets. The desert continued in its ancient indifference. The generators hummed. The wind flags moved in their patient rhythm. The thermals above the hardpan completed their cycle. Left, release, reset, on schedule, as they had all day, caring nothing for what had happened on the firing line. Evidence, it turned out, was not interested in anyone's narrative about it. It simply existed, whole and immovable, 2 miles down the range. And as Reyes surveyed the data station and Calloway wrote and wrote in the amber failing light, and as Okafor stood near the equipment cases and learned something difficult about himself without anyone making him do it, a black government vehicle had already left the highway and was moving across the access road toward Dugway Proving Ground. Colonel Marcus Webb had made a phone call from Washington that afternoon. He had pulled a file. He had seen a name. He was already on his way. The desert does not mark time the way people do. It does not observe the difference between before and after. It does not register the weight of what has happened on a firing line, or the particular quality of silence that follows a shot that changes the shape of things. It simply continues, heat and hard pan, and the long, flat patience of a landscape that has been here longer than any of the people standing on it, and will remain long after every one of them is gone. But inside Dugway Proving Ground, as the afternoon light went amber and the shadows from the equipment cases stretched long across the sand pointing east, something had permanently and irrevocably divided. There was the time before the shot, and there was everything that came after it. Case Mercer had spent an hour with Calloway at the data station, working through every adjustment she had made, every variable she had calculated, every timing decision she had arrived at through the patient observation of a range that had been telling its story all day to anyone willing to listen. Calloway wrote in a way that suggested he had not written this quickly or this carefully in some time, his shorthand filling 4 pages of his engineering notebook and then overflowing onto a fresh legal pad when he ran out of room, the pen moving with the urgency of a man who understands he is transcribing something that has not been written down anywhere before and might not come this clearly again. The other technicians moved in and out of the conversation. They pulled up atmospheric logs on their tablets and cross-referenced them against Casey's numbers with the focused energy of people who have encountered a problem they actually want to solve, which was different from the energy that had been on the range 4 hours ago. Reyes moved between stations, asking the occasional short question, saying nothing that was not necessary. He had the quality of a good officer, knowing when to direct and when to stay out of the way of something already moving in the right direction. Kohler stood near the transport vehicles. He had moved there gradually over the last hour, without announcement, until he was at the edge of the activity rather than inside it. His specialist had drifted toward the data station, following the gravity of what was happening there. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man waiting for something he cannot name but can feel approaching. He knew it was coming. He had known it since the shot landed. Casey did not look at him. She had not looked at him since she rose from the firing position. This was not strategy and not deliberate avoidance. There was simply nothing in his direction she needed to see. The work was here, with Calloway and the data and the careful reconstruction of a methodology that had existed in her father's understanding for over 30 years and had never been formally written down anywhere that anyone could find it. That was the thing she kept returning to, in the spaces between Calloway's questions. Frank Mercer had developed this approach to thermal pattern recognition and Coriolis compensation during Desert Storm. He had used it to make a shot that his range officer had categorized as inconsistent with the documented conditions and had declined to fully record. He had come home from that war with the knowledge held in his hands and his eyes, and the specific part of his brain that processed atmospheric information the way other people process language, naturally, intuitively, below the level of conscious calculation. He had spent the next 2 decades passing it to his daughter in the fields and forests of Montana without ever calling it anything more formal than paying attention. It had never been submitted to a program. It had never been reviewed by engineers or validated against a controlled data set. It had simply been true, and because it was true, it had traveled from Frank Mercer's understanding to Casey Mercer's understanding, and from there to the center of a steel plate at 2,850 meters. First round, no correction required. Calloway set his pen down and looked at what he had written. "This is more accurate than our instrumentation," he said quietly, as a professional statement of fact, rather than compliment. The thermal cycle identification, the density layer adjustment for Coriolis, our sensor array is designed to measure instantaneous values and correct in real time. What you're describing is a fundamentally different approach. "It's not correcting in real time," Casey said. "It's predicting. You read the pattern, understand the cycle, and time the shot to the moment when the atmosphere is doing what you need, rather than trying to compensate for what it's doing." Calloway looked at his notes. "Your father developed this. He taught it to me. He just called it reading the air." Calloway wrote that down, exactly as she had said it, with quotation marks. "I want to include this in the Mk-31's updated operational manual," he said, "with full attribution. The approach, the mathematical framework as you've described it today, the correction methodology." Casey was quiet for a moment. "It's not my method," she said. "It's my father's, Frank Mercer, 3rd Infantry Division. Desert Storm, 1991. She paused. "Put his name in it." Calloway did not hesitate. He wrote the name at the top of a fresh page in clear block letters, underlined it, and wrote the date and unit designation beneath it. He did it the way people do things when they understand that the act of recording is itself a form of justice, of setting something right that should have been set right a long time ago. The sun was lower now. The light on the mountains to the west had turned the shade of amber that belongs specifically to the American West at the end of a long day. The generators hummed. The wind flags moved. Reyes was at the data station when his radio produced 2 short tones. He lifted it, listened, looked toward the access road. A black government vehicle moved across the hardpan, trailing a thin line of dust. It moved with the unhurried authority of something that does not need to announce itself. It stopped at the equipment perimeter. The door opened. Colonel Marcus Webb stepped out, 61 years old. He carried those years the way certain men carry them, not as weight, but as dimension, the accumulated depth of a life lived in serious places, making serious decisions. He was lean in the way of a man who has never stopped moving, gray at his temples, with eyes that processed information the way a rangefinder processes distance, quickly, accurately, without sentiment. He did not greet the group. He did not acknowledge the evaluation setup or make any of the social gestures people make when entering a space where others have been working. He walked directly to the data station, where the footage of the shot was running on the primary monitor. He watched it once, then again, then a third time, stopping the frame at the moment of impact and holding it. His jaw moved slightly, the movement of a man doing arithmetic against information he has been carrying for a long time. Then he picked up the tablet where Casey's personnel file had been pulled and read it the way he had once read terrain, systematically, looking for what was there and what should have been there and wasn't. He found the administrative flag, read its metadata, read the date, read the procedural authority under which it had been filed. He set the tablet down. He looked at Calloway. "The flag on her record," he said. "You found it." "When I pulled her file for the evaluation manifest," Calloway said. "Do you know who placed it?" Calloway looked at him steadily. "Kohler, 18 months ago, after she outscored him in the Fort Carson qualification review. The flag suppressed her performance scores from standard readouts." Webb was quiet. He looked at the footage monitor, the frame still frozen on the moment of impact. Then he looked out across the range, toward the distant berm where a steel plate sat with its new geometry. He gave a single, slow nod. The nod of a man who has confirmed something he suspected and finds no satisfaction in it because confirmation is not the point. The point is what comes next. He turned and found Casey Mercer. She was standing slightly apart from the data station cluster, with her notebook and her cap pushed back, and the stillness that had been with her all day. She was looking at him with the direct, level gaze of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to perform. He walked toward her. The group parted without being asked. People step back the way people step back when they understand that what is about to happen between two people is not for the room. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face the way a man looks at something he has been trying to place for a long time and has finally placed it. "You're Frank Mercer's daughter," he said. It was not a question. Casey held his gaze. "Yes, sir." The silence that followed had weight to it. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of something having already happened, and everyone present slowly understanding what it was. Reyes stood very still. Two technicians exchanged a glance that carried more information than either of them could have put into words. Okafor, at the edge of the group, looked up from the ground and then back at the ground with more to think about than before. Kohler, near the transport vehicles, had gone very still. He was watching Webb walk toward Casey Mercer, and his arms had dropped from their crossed position and hung at his sides, and he looked like a man who has just understood that the thing he was afraid of has already happened, and that there is nothing left to do now but stand in it. Webb gave a single slow nod. Then he turned to Reyes. "My office, 1 hour, bring her." The conference room in Dugway's operations building was spare and functional. A folding table, 4 chairs, a wall-mounted screen still showing the range footage, overhead fluorescent lighting that served information rather than comfort. Webb sat at the head of the table with both hands flat on the surface. Reyes to his left, Casey across from them with the composed posture of someone who understands that this moment requires presence rather than performance, who has been preparing for something like it without knowing its exact shape for a long time. Calloway sat in the corner at Webb's request, technical witness. He had barely written anything since entering the room. He was listening. Webb looked at the table, then at Casey. "Since you made that shot, I have watched that footage 4 times, he said. "The adjustments you made, manual, unaided, on a platform you had never fired in a controlled setting, were correct. Every variable, every timing decision, every compensation, correct." Casey said nothing. She let him continue. "Your father used to say that a real shooter doesn't fight the environment." Webb's voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of a man choosing words that have been earned. He said the environment is not the problem. The environment is the information. Your job is to read it accurately enough to move with it. He paused. He was right, and so were you today. Reyes leaned forward slightly. "You've honored the uniform, Mercer," said quietly once. It landed the way true things land. The door opened without a knock. Kohler came in with his face arranged in the expression of a man who has prepared an argument and intends to deliver it regardless of the room. His posture was military, and his voice was controlled, and everything about him telegraphs someone who intends to get ahead of a situation before it defines him. "Sir, with respect," looking at Webb, "protocol was broken. The observer designation exists for a reason. If we begin making exceptions based on—" "Sergeant," Webb said the word the way a door closes. Not loudly, completely. Kohler stopped. "Captain Reyes authorized the shot," Webb said. "That is within his authority and his evaluation charter." The pause that followed had architecture. "I have reviewed the footage of your conduct during today's evaluation." The room went very still. "I have also reviewed the administrative flag placed on Specialist Mercer's personnel file 18 months ago. The flag that suppressed her qualification scores from standard readouts. The flag filed under a procedural authority that was within your access, but was not intended for this purpose." Webb's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You will report to the command adjutant at 0800 tomorrow morning for a formal review of your conduct toward a fellow soldier and the administrative actions you took 18 months ago regarding her personnel record." A beat. That is not a request. Kohler's prepared argument did not disappear. It turned into something else, something that had no words built into it, no procedural next step, no ground left to stand on. He stood in the silence for one long moment. Then he turned and walked to the door and left the room, and the door closed behind him with a soft, final click that was somehow louder than anything that had been said. Calloway exhaled slowly in the corner. Webb turned back to Casey. He looked at her with the quality of attention that belongs to a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has identified the right moment to set it down. "I need to tell you something," he said. Casey waited. "In the spring of 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, your father made a shot." Webb's voice had changed slightly, still precise, still measured, but with something underneath it now that had been there for 34 years. 1,100 meters, full crosswind, no computer assistance, no spotter. The conditions were what the range officer later described as statistically inconsistent with a first-round hit. He paused. "I was the only witness." Casey was very still. "I filed a report. The range officer declined to fully document it. He categorized the environmental conditions differently than I had recorded them. The shot disappeared from the record the way things sometimes disappear when they don't fit inside what people believe is possible." Webb looked at the table for a moment, then back at Casey. "I have thought about that shot a great many times in the last 34 years. I have thought about the man who made it and the fact that he made it look like the most natural thing in the world. And I have thought about what it would mean if he had passed that to someone. If that understanding of how the air works, the rhythm of it, the patience required to read it, had traveled forward somehow." He was quiet. "Now I know it did." The room was completely silent. Casey looked at Webb for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not grief, not relief, not triumph. Something that did not have a clean name in any language, but that anyone who has ever carried someone they loved inside the work they do would recognize immediately without needing it explained. "He never told me anyone saw it," she said. Webb nodded once. "He wouldn't. That was frank." The silence held for a moment, not empty but full, the way silences are when they contain something that has finally arrived where it was always going. Then Casey looked at Calloway. "The attribution in the manual," she said. "Frank Mercer, 3rd Infantry, Desert Storm." She paused. "Make sure the 1991 shot is documented too. The conditions, the distance, the methodology. It should have been on record 34 years ago." Calloway was already writing. Webb supplied the details, one at a time. The date, the grid coordinates northeast of Kuwait City, the wind conditions, the distance, the atmospheric factors that made the shot what it was. And Calloway recorded each one carefully, the two of them reconstructing a record that should have existed in 1991 and was only now, finally, finding its proper place in the world. Webb slid a folder across the table. Casey looked at it. She did not reach for it immediately. "There is a position on the Precision Development Team attached to the Army Marksmanship Unit at Fort Benning," Webb said. "It is not a posting you apply for. It is a posting that exists for people who demonstrate a particular kind of capability in a particular kind of situation." He nodded toward the folder. "I am offering it to you now." Casey looked at the folder. Inside, visible through the open cover, was a transfer order already signed in Webb's handwriting. She thought about Frank Mercer standing in the Montana rain with mud on his boots and gun oil on his hands, telling her not to let them put a ceiling on her. She thought about the VA hospital in Columbus and his hands shaking in hers, and his voice still steady, still precise, still telling her exactly what she needed to hear. She thought about a shot made in the Iraqi desert in 1991 that had lived for 34 years in the memory of one witness and in the hands and eyes of the man who made it, and then in the hands and eyes of his daughter, and that had traveled all that distance to land finally in the center of a steel plate in the Utah hardpan and in the careful block letters of a civilian engineer's notebook. She picked up the folder. When do I report? Monday, Webb said. She nodded once. No theater, no visible emotion beyond the quiet, composed acknowledgement of a woman who had known this moment was coming in some form and had simply been doing the work of being ready for it. Calloway spoke for the first time since entering the room, in a voice slightly different from the precise technical register he had maintained all day. For the record specialist, your read on the thermal cycle was more accurate than our sensor array. The pattern recognition approach your father developed is not documented anywhere in current precision targeting literature. I want to include the full methodology in the platform manual, the mathematical framework, the historical context, everything, with attribution. He paused. If you'll allow it. Casey looked at him. His name goes first, she said. Everything that follows comes from him. Calloway wrote it down the way people write down things they want to make certain they get exactly right. Carefully, completely, without abbreviation. Outside the window, the Utah desert had moved into the long evening light that softens the hardpan into something almost gentle and turns the distant mountains deep blue against the cooling sky. The generators hummed, indifferent as ever. The wind flags moved in their patient rhythm. The following morning, Casey packed her gear in the Dugway barracks with the same economy she brought to everything. No ceremony, no lingering over what the place had tried to make her feel. The duffel bag filled and closed and placed by the door with the clean finality of a chapter that had said everything it needed to say. Okafor was in the corridor. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his posture carrying something different from yesterday. The easy confidence was absent. In its place was something that had been arrived at through a night of sitting with information he could not organize into a comfortable shape, of doing the kind of accounting that has no satisfying total. He looked at her and started to speak, and stopped. Looked at the floor, tried again. I saw your numbers, he said, when I took the notebook. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I saw them. And later, when I compared them to the auto-compensation readouts, he stopped. I knew I should have said something before you ever had to ask for that shot. Casey looked at him with the level regard she had given everything over the last 2 days. Not cold, not forgiving, not interested in either performance. Just accurate. Next time you see something wrong, she said, say something. That's the job. She picked up her duffel and walked past him and into the dry Utah morning. The transport to the airfield left at 0700. Casey sat near the window and watched Dugway recede through the scratched plexiglass. The white buildings and tan hardpan contracting into geometry, then into abstraction, then into the flat, tan sameness of a desert that held no record of what had happened there and had no interest in keeping one. She let herself think about Frank, not the hospital version, not the man with the cane and the shaking hands and the oxygen tank by the chair, the Montana version, the man who stood in a creek in October with his boots in the cold water and pointed to the shimmer on the surface and said that the wind was writing its name in the light and that the job was to learn the alphabet. She thought about his shot in 1991, about the range officer who had declined to document it, in the 34 years it had lived only in Webb's memory, and in the methodological inheritance Frank had passed to her without ceremony, as though it were simply the natural thing a father gives a daughter who is paying attention. It was documented now. His name was in Calloway's notebook in block letters, underlined, with the date and the unit and the conditions in the mathematical framework that had traveled from his hands to hers. The 1991 shot was there too, the distance, the crosswind, the atmospheric conditions that the range officer had categorized as inconsistent with a first-round hit. On record now, attributed correctly, available to anyone who needed it. She opened her notebook to the first page. The handwriting there was not hers. It was older, slightly unsteady toward the end from the tremors that had come with the illness. But the words were clear. Frank had written them the morning she left for basic training, pressed the notebook into her hands at the door of the Montana house, with the mountains behind him and the early light making everything sharp and clean. She had read them hundreds of times, in barracks, in ranges, in mess halls, in transports, and every quiet moment in between. Outthink the wind, Case. It's smarter than any man you'll meet, but not smarter than you. She closed the notebook. Outside the window, the Utah desert continued in its ancient patience. The hard pan held the early light. The thermals above the flat ground were beginning their morning cycle, building toward the rhythm that would be fully established by mid-morning. The same 42-second spiral that had been there yesterday and would be there tomorrow. Patient and consistent and perfectly legible to anyone willing to sit still long enough to learn to read it. 2,850 meters from the firing line, a steel plate sat in the morning sun with a hole through its center. The desert was already at work on it, fine red dust collecting at the edges, the evidence of what had happened there being slowly, indifferently incorporated into the landscape the way the desert incorporates everything. Without judgment, without interest, simply receiving it. But the record existed now, in block letters in a civilian engineer's notebook. In the operational manual of a precision rifle platform the United States Army would field for the next 2 decades. In the formal documentation of a shot made in Iraq in 1991 that had waited 34 years to be written down correctly. In the transfer order signed by a colonel who had been the only witness to something impossible and had spent 34 years waiting to see where it had gone. It had gone here, to this woman, to this morning, to one round fired in a half-second of flat, clean air between the cycles of a thermal pattern that everyone else on the range had categorized as noise. The transport reached the airfield. The plane was on the tarmac. Casey picked up her duffel and walked across the hot concrete toward the stairs without looking back. At Fort Benning, new ranges waited, new distances and new elevations, new winds with their own rhythms and their own secrets, and their own patterns that could be learned by anyone patient enough to watch them long enough and honest enough to stop fighting what they could not yet read. She would read those too. She had learned from the best teacher she had ever known, and she carried his methodology in her hands, and his name on a record that would outlast both of them, and his words in a notebook she had been carrying since the morning she left home. She buckled her seatbelt as the engines came up. She allowed herself one thought, directed at no one and everyone, at Frank Mercer standing in a Montana field 30 years ago, teaching a 12-year-old girl that everything has a rhythm, at a shot made in the Iraqi desert that the record had declined to remember, at a steel plate 2 miles down a Utah hardpan that would never let anyone forget. Sometimes the quietest soldiers carry the loudest legacies. She was ready.